I was 13 when the fog first came thick over Charleston, not the kind that rolls in and fades by morning, but a low, clinging mist that held to the cobblestones like it was listening. Back then, I didn't question much. I helped Mama hang wash, fed our hens before school, and played by the marshes until the sun told me to head home. But that year, something shifted in the air. I remember the way folks spoke in hushed voices even at the market, like the silence itself had grown ears. We all felt it, though no one dared name it. Something invisible had taken up residence among us. When Reverend Silas Reed arrived that autumn, people saw it as a blessing, a calm, clean man with straight posture, and a face that didn't flinch when others looked too long. His clothes were plain but neat, his boots always polished. He came with no wife, no family, just a modest suitcase and a weathered Bible he held like it meant more to him than air. He spoke little at first. The elders said he had a northern accent, soft but strange, and that he was here to restore the spirit of the flock. No one asked where he came from. In Charleston, politeness could be a shield. I saw him for the first time standing outside the old First Parish Church, the one with the sagging roof, and a bell that hadn't rung right since the storm of '42. He was just standing there looking up at the steeple, as if listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. His eyes didn't dart like most strangers, they lingered. He noticed me across the road, nodded once, then turned his gaze back toward the sky. I don't know why, but I remember feeling the hair rise on the back of my neck, like someone had spoken my name, though no one had. That was the first moment I wondered if this man was sent here for reasons we wouldn't understand until it was too late. I didn't speak to him the day I first saw him by the church, but I couldn't stop thinking about him afterward. It wasn't just his presence, it was how quiet the world felt around him. Days later, I was sent by my mother to deliver a pie to the rectory. Reverend Reed had just finished his first sermon that Sunday. The congregation filed out slowly, quieter than usual, as if unsure how to digest the words they'd just heard. I hadn't been inside the service, but I waited by the side steps until he appeared. He walked out alone, no deacon, no handshakes, just that same unreadable face, and eyes that scanned the horizon like he expected it to shift. When I handed him the pie, his fingers brushed mine, cold, not just from the air, something deeper. He thanked me, but his voice was slower than I expected, almost careful, like he measured each word before letting it loose. He asked my name, and I told him. Then he said something odd, not unkind, just strange. He said, "You remember more than most your age. That can be a heavy thing." I didn't know what he meant, but it stuck with me. I remember nodding without answering, holding my breath for reasons I couldn't explain. He smiled faintly, then though it never reached his eyes, that smile felt rehearsed, like a gesture he had learned long ago but never believed in. Over the next few weeks, he kept to himself. He held services every Sunday, never missed a sermon, but beyond that, no one saw him much. He didn't sit at the cafe with the other clergy, didn't walk through the market, didn't take part in town meetings, and yet, people were drawn to him. His voice during sermons was hypnotic, not dramatic or emotional, but still, like water that ran deep beneath rock. I started attending just to watch him, that didn't understand half of what he said, but the way he moved, the way silence gathered around his words, it pulled at something in me I didn't have a name for. There was something beneath the surface of that man, something watching back. It started with whispers, after Sunday services, low, uneasy things, spoken behind gloved hands, as people shuffled down the church steps. They weren't gossiping in the usual way, not like when someone's child got caught stealing from the apothecary, or when old Mrs. Drayton's husband didn't come home for 2 nights in a row. These whispers were different, uneasy, uncertain, the kind of murmurs that people didn't want to say too loud in case something heard them. I remember standing near the fountain after one service and hearing a woman say, "He never goes home." I passed the rectory one night. The windows were dark. Her companion only nodded, pulling her shawl tighter like she'd just stepped into a chill. I started to notice things too. I'd pass by the rectory in the evenings on my way home, and it always looked empty. No light, no flicker from a fire. Once, out of pure curiosity, I walked closer. The door was locked, dust collecting at the threshold, and the shutters hung slightly open, creaking with every gust. It didn't look lived in, not even visited, but every Sunday morning, there he was, fresh and clean, as though he'd never left. Some of the boys joked that he slept in the church itself, in the crypt beneath the altar. One even dared me to find out. I laughed then, pretending not to care, but deep down I was already wondering if they were right. The strangest rumor came from the butcher's son, Thomas, who said he'd seen Reverend Reed walking down the marsh path behind the cemetery long after midnight. Not just once, but often. Said he walked slow, like he was looking for something, or waiting. That part caught me. Waiting for what? I knew that marsh trail. It led nowhere but reeds and frogs, and the occasional rusted fishing hook from decades ago. There was nothing back there, just still water and forgotten graves. And yet, each Sunday, the preacher's voice seemed even steadier, even calmer, as if the more the town wondered, the more rooted he became, like he was feeding off our attention, or worse, like he was getting ready for something. It was just after dusk when I saw them, the preacher and a man I'd never seen before, standing beside the old stone well behind the chapel. I hadn't meant to spy. I was returning from the widow Allen's place with a basket of fresh biscuits for Mama, cutting through the back path to get home faster. The sky was bruising into violet, and the lamps hadn't yet been lit. That's when I heard voices, not angry, but tight, like an argument being forced into a whisper. I stopped, crouched behind the oak fence near the stables, and peeked through the slats. The stranger was tall and thin, coat dirty with travel. His back was to me, but his gestures were sharp. His hand pointed once at Reverend Reed's chest, then out toward the graveyard. The preacher stood still, arms crossed. He didn't speak much, but when he did, the stranger quieted. That's what I remember most, the silence that followed. It wasn't natural, not even the insects hummed. No wind, just two figures in the stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. Then the man stepped back, looked around quickly, and slipped into the trees behind the cemetery like a shadow swallowed up by the earth. Reverend Reed didn't move right away. He stared down into the well for what felt like a full minute, before slowly backing away from it and returning toward the church. I waited until his footsteps faded before I stood and made my way home, heart knocking in my chest. I told no one, not because I was afraid, though I was, but because I couldn't explain what I'd seen in a way that made sense. Who was that man? Why had they met in secret, behind the church, at a well no one used anymore? And what had he meant when he pointed toward the graves? Something about that night changed the air around Reverend Reed. From then on I felt it even stronger, that feeling that he was not just a man who preached about heaven and hell. He carried something unspoken, and I feared whatever it was beginning to stir. The first person to go missing was Elijah Merritt, a trapper who lived alone by the river bend. He wasn't the kind of man people worried about right away. He'd disappear for days on end, following game trails deep into the woods, only returning when he ran low on tobacco or needed whiskey. But after 2 weeks passed, and his hounds were found tied to a tree near town, ribs showing, water bowls bone dry, folks began to talk. The sheriff searched the river banks, even sent a few boys out to the marsh trails. Nothing turned up. No blood, no signs of struggle, just absence. Then the school teacher vanished. Miss Constance Hill. That was different. Constance didn't wander. She lived in the room above the millinery, and was always punctual, always visible. She was last seen walking home from the Sunday market, a parasol tucked under one arm. Her front door was left open, her gloves still folded on the table. That was when the fear took hold of Charleston like a sickness. You could see it in how people walked. Faster, heads down, voices low. The church filled more than usual. People needed comfort, and Reverend Reed gave it. Calm, measured words about faith, about storms passing, about evil not being eternal. But even as he preached, something didn't sit right with me. I watched him closely now. He never looked surprised when someone was reported missing. He never asked for details, and he never offered to help search, just stood at the pulpit, hands folded, eyes steady, telling us that some things pass through our lives as shadows. I wondered what kind of shadow took a trapper and a schoolteacher without leaving a footprint. I began noticing other things too, scratches on the chapel door in the shape of crosses, deep ones, as if someone had carved them in haste, and a bell. The church bell rang one evening, when no one was there to ring it. People said it was just wind, but I knew the wind doesn't pull ropes. It was a Tuesday when I saw the candlelight, the kind of night where the fog didn't roll. It simply sat, heavy, unmoving, like breath held too long. I couldn't sleep. The house creaked more than usual, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint bells in my mind, as though something long silenced was calling out again. I got up to fetch water from the kitchen, and noticed a dim glow outside my window. At first, I thought it was just a lantern swaying in the wind, but it didn't move like that. It hovered, slow, intentional, as if someone were guiding it through the night. I crept outside in my nightshirt, barefoot, careful not to wake Mama. The grass was damp underfoot, and each step felt heavier than the last. The light floated along the path toward the edge of the cemetery, flickering low and golden. I followed from a distance, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what drew me there, curiosity or fear, or something in between. The air felt thick, like walking through a dream. When I reached the wrought iron gate, I saw him, Reverend Reed, standing at the doors of the old chapel no longer in use, a building the town had boarded up after a fire had scorched half its pews 20 years before. He held a single candle in his hand, and disappeared inside without a sound. I waited, thought about leaving, but then I stepped forward and peered through a crack in the warped wood. Inside, the flame cast strange shadows against the stained walls. The preacher stood before the pulpit, not speaking, not praying, just standing, motionless. Then slowly he knelt. I thought he was praying until I saw him reach down and touch the floor. There was something drawn there, a circle, etched in chalk or dust, with symbols I couldn't understand. My breath caught. He stood again, blew out the candle, and the chapel plunged into darkness. I didn't move for minutes. When I finally turned to go, I didn't run. I walked, like I was afraid my own footsteps would betray me. I didn't sleep that night, and in the morning, I told no one. It was a Sunday morning, when the silence became too loud. The church bell didn't ring. No bird song, no market chatter in the distance, only the heavy stillness that seeps into your bones before your mind catches up. I sat at the window, watching the path that led to the first parish church, expecting to see Reverend Reed's black coat appear through the mist like always. But the path stayed empty. At first I thought maybe he was late, but that man had never been late. He was always early, always there before the rest of us. That morning the door to the church remained shut, and the bell rope hung motionless. Whispers spread by mid-morning. Mrs. Carlton, the housekeeper who brought fresh bread to the rectory each week, knocked but got no answer. The sheriff was called, and by afternoon a few men gathered at the chapel steps. I joined them, keeping to the edge of the crowd. When they entered the rectory, they found it just as it had always looked from the outside, untouched. A thin layer of dust coated the shelves. No fire in the hearth, no food, no belongings. The bed was made, the sheets stiff with age. On the desk the Bible lay open. I stepped forward when no one else would, and looked at the page. The passage was from Ezekiel, something about judgment falling on those who pretend to see light in the darkness. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints outside, no luggage missing, no farewell note. He was simply gone. And that terrified us more than anything. The idea of being taken leaves room for blame, but vanishing without a trace, that makes you question everything. The land, the air, your own memory. That evening, the bell rang once, just once. No hand touched the rope. I know because I stayed near the church until nightfall watching, and when it rang, I felt something twist deep in my stomach, like the sound didn't come from above, but from beneath. The grass grew fast that summer, as if something beneath the soil wanted the church buried. Vines crept up the wooden doors, choking the hinges and climbing the steeple like slow green fingers. No one tended the building after Reverend Reed vanished. The sermon stopped, so did the prayers. Folks passed the first parish with their heads down, crossing themselves without thinking. A few whispered that the church was cursed now, not just abandoned, but tainted. The elders suggested boarding it up again, but no one volunteered to do the hammering. No one wanted to be that close for that long. Mama told me to stop asking questions about the preacher. She said it wasn't our business to chase ghosts, but something about that church kept tugging at me. I went back alone one afternoon, weeks after his disappearance, when the clouds were low and the air smelled like iron. I stepped inside through a broken side door, careful not to disturb anything. Dust clung to the pews, dead insects lay curled in the corners. The altar stood untouched, except for the floor beneath it. That's where I saw the carvings, deep gouges in the wood, like someone had taken a blade and scrawled something in a desperate hand. One word, over and over, as if it mattered more than the walls themselves. The letters weren't just scratches, they were angry, rushed, some overlapped, like they'd been etched over again and again. I couldn't breathe right standing there, like the air itself was pressing in against my ribs. I backed out, and didn't stop, until I reached the main road. That night, I dreamed of the chapel filling with water, rising slowly, with no one inside to drown except the preacher, standing still, as the tide reached his mouth. When I woke, the sound of the bell echoed in my ears. I checked the window, no one was there. But I swear, for a moment I saw a figure, standing beneath the steeple, hands folded, watching, and just like that, it was gone. It was nearly 5 years later when I returned to Charleston. I'd left after Mama passed, taken work on a coastal ferry line, tried to forget the weight that clung to that church and all it had swallowed, but time has a strange way of folding back on itself. I came home after hearing that Mr. Dunn, the groundskeeper who used to keep the cemetery neat, had died in his sleep. No one had taken his place. They said the graves had gone wild, the stone markers tilting like teeth in a crooked mouth, the weeds thick as snakes. I don't know why, but I felt pulled to see it again. Not the town, not the neighbors, just the place I had spent years avoiding in memory. The graveyard looked worse than I imagined. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of moss and wet stone. Crickets chirped low under the brush, but even they sounded tired. I stepped through the broken gate and made my way to the old chapel. Its roof had finally caved in, and half the front wall had collapsed under years of rain. I should have turned back, but something told me not to. Instead, I walked around the side, past the crumbled tombs, until I noticed something odd, a patch of ground that had sunk ever so slightly, forming a shallow basin beneath the roots of a twisted oak. The earth felt wrong beneath my boots, too soft, too hollow. Curiosity overtook fear. I dug with my bare hands first, then with a rusted spade I found, leaning behind a broken headstone. The soil gave easily, like it wanted to be opened. After several layers I hit something solid, A stone slab, carved with markings I didn't recognize. I heaved it aside, and the smell hit me first. Dry rot and something older, metallic. Beneath the slab was a sealed crypt, its wooden lid, long decayed. Inside were bones, many of them. Some animal but some not. Among the remains was a folded black coat, still intact despite the years, and beside it, a small silver locket. I picked it up carefully, heart racing. When I opened it, I nearly dropped it. Inside was a faded sketch, the face of Constance Hill, the missing school teacher. Her initials were etched on the back, in delicate script. That was when I knew Reverend Reed hadn't vanished into thin air. He'd been waiting below us all along, and whatever he brought with him hadn't finished what it came for. I left Charleston the next morning. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't even go back to where I was staying. Just walked to the station and waited for the train, locket still in my coat pocket, hands filthy from grave dirt, mind reeling. I thought distance would help, that by putting miles between me and that graveyard, I could put it all behind me. Reverend Reed, the disappearances, that strange circle beneath the altar. But the further I got from Charleston, the more that silence seemed to stretch out behind me, like a cord I couldn't cut. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that ruined church with its vines and shadows, and somewhere behind it, the sound of the bell. It was always just one ring, never more, once a year, always on the same day, the Sunday closest to when he vanished. I don't know how I knew the date, but I felt it in my bones. Each time, I'd hear it at the edge of sleep, a clear toll, deep and slow, like it traveled through time instead of space. At first, I told myself it was my mind playing tricks, some lingering guilt, some unresolved fear, but I wasn't the only one. I received a letter one year from Ruth Middleton, who still lived near the edge of town. She said no one dared go near the church, but every year the bell rang, and the door creaked open. No wind, no animals, no footprints in the mud, just a sound, and a feeling that someone was standing inside. It's been nearly 20 years now. I've grown older than Reverend Reed ever looked, but on quiet nights, especially when the air feels heavy, I still hear the bell, and with it, that feeling I had the first time I saw him looking up at the steeple, like he wasn't seeing a building, but something else entirely, something waiting to be released. I sometimes wonder if that church was ever truly meant for us. Maybe it was a doorway, a warning, or maybe it was a net, and we were the ones caught inside it. I no longer visit Charleston, but sometimes, in dreams, I'm walking those foggy paths again, and I see him, not older, not younger, just exactly as he was, standing beneath the bell tower, hands folded, watching.